We've been sitting here for like 5 minutes trying to figure out how to start this podcast. And sometimes we don't have catchy lines. We just want to talk about trolling today, so that we're just going to get right into it.
We're just going to talk about fishing today. So, welcome to the Level Up Fishing Podcast.
I am Stormy Cochran.
And I'm Andy Cochran. We are the owners of GSO Fishing.
Andy does a lot of seminars. He also does on the water trainings. And something that we're trying to get into that we've done several of, but we struggle with a little bit is instant digital Zoom type trainings. One thing we struggle with is figuring out how to take what you learn in person and turn it into an online course and get the same amount from it. And that's something we're struggling with a little bit, but we're going to get there. I think we're doing pretty good so far. We haven't had any complaints, but Andy and I are kind of perfectionists and we know we can make it better, but we haven't quite figured that out yet.
Yeah, I'm a very visual learner and a very hands-on teacher. And so on the water seminars or in-person seminars tend to work better for me. I feel like I can convey the message better in person. So, but through doing in-person classes and seminars, we're starting to get a way better handle on how that information is conveyed to the people that want to hear it. So that's going to help us put a lot of this information out as a digital course to be able to help a lot more people with what we want to teach. So in this podcast, we wanted to take some of the info that we've presented on these classes to our audience here on the podcast to help you learn how to catch more fish and sort of put it out there that trolling, which is what we're talking about today, is one of our favorite techniques for nearly all the species that we fish for.
Yeah. And you did a class just today on the water training about trolling, and that's kind of what sparked this podcast episode. Listening to you talk about it and go over how the class went afterwards, I was like, we gotta put some of this in the podcast.
Yeah. So what the first thing we want to address is I personally don't like the word trolling.
Mm-hmm.
I like to call that technique or style of fishing precision depth controlled fishing. There's so much more that goes on behind the scenes when you're trolling, so to speak, that if you just say, oh, I went out trolling today, the first thing that pops into your mind for a lot of people when they hear that is, oh, you had a 12-pack and you just went and hung out on the boat and drove around in circles. And it's like, no, like it's a very fine-tuned, very specific system that is highly effective when done properly.
And we are not judging anyone that does, well, you shouldn't drink and drive your boat. That is one thing. But we're not judging anyone who does want to just go out and troll around in a circle. And that's okay. Yeah. If that's what you want to do, that's totally fine. We do it a little differently.
So when you sign up for a trolling seminar with us or attend one in person like at an ISE show or something, we're called a trolling seminar, but what we talk about is the precision of it.
Mm-hmm.
And what that we went through in the on the water class today was all the little nuances that bring your catch rates from a few fish a day to dozens and dozens of fish a day to expecting to limit out on your species every day and the system involved with that whole process.
So let's start off. What are the different tools you can use to troll?
So trolling, when we start talking about depth controlled fishing, what we mean is there's the vast majority of the season, the target species are typically not at the surface of any body of water that you're trying to fish. Obviously, there are times and places where that's the case, but for the majority of the trolling season, we need methods and tools to get our desired lures down to where the fish live in the water column. So that's a lot of the stuff that we talk about in our seminars, is all the available options for you to control the depth while you're trolling.
What are those?
So the common ones are downriggers, there's snap weights, there's dipsy divers, jet divers, pink ladies, and like trolling weights, which are all like an inline diving tool that dive your lures down. And then there's stuff like lead core line, which is a heavy sinking line. And then you can incorporate tools like planer boards to help cover more area around your boat, and incorporate those with systems like snap weights so you can get a little bit bigger spread behind your boat. So there's a lot of different things that you can use while you're trolling to get your gear both spread out and spread down through the water column.
What is your preferred?
So in most of our system trainings, what we try to go through is, I want to show you all the tools there are, because certain tools work better for certain people's situations or budgets. But at the end of the day, I always want everything to be as efficient and simple as possible. So in our situation where we guide fishing a lot and we have folks that come out that don't have any experience with any of this style equipment, everything needs to be as simple and straightforward as we can get it, because at the end of the day, the goal is to catch more fish.
Mm-hmm.
And the more simple and efficient, organized tools and methods that you use, the more successful that part of the trip can be for everyone. So you're not dealing with extra equipment or extra steps in the fish landing process, taking things off, removing them, adding leader lengths to different diving tools. So when we break all that stuff out, at the end of the day, I use downriggers and lead core line, both very efficient ways to reach fish at certain depths in the water column. And when you hook a fish, bringing it into the boat is just as simple as reeling the fish into the back of the boat.
And to be clear, you use downriggers and lead core line, but not together.
Right, you don't use lead core line
Right.
on a downrigger, but we use the system.
Yeah.
Each rig is separate, but it's all utilized at the same time.
So to visualize Andy's boat, he's got 2 downriggers on the back of his boat, and then each downrigger holds 2 poles. And then on the side of his boat, he's got rod holder, and that's where he puts the rods with the lead core line, and they go off the side. So he has 4 poles going off the back and 2 poles going off the side. So he'll run, depending on how many people and licenses are on the boat, but generally he runs 6 poles off the back of the boat.
Yep, so that gives us the most efficient spread without getting overwhelmed with so much more tackle. Obviously, there's situations where we could run 8 or 10 poles and utilize planer boards and surface lines and a bunch of other stuff. But when you start catching a lot of fish at once, then you're more prone to having fish tangle up into other lines, and then that causes its own set of problems. So
Right.
depending on what you're doing, what you're fishing for, what your situation is, there's a lot of different tools available for you. And at the end of the day, for what we do, that is my preferred system.
Okay, so let's talk about this. It is a highly, highly, highly effective system when done correctly. But from a guide perspective, and I know this because of booking clients and you talking to clients to book, but some people get very turned off from the idea of trolling when going out on the lake to go fishing. Why do you think that is?
So for me, looking at it from an angler's perspective, there's a lot to be said about having a rod in your hand and presenting a lure yourself and being able to impart action into the lure that you're using to entice the fish to bite it, and then feeling the bite and setting the hook. That whole process, there's a lot of individual satisfaction with that.
Mm-hmm.
So you totally understand that.
Yeah.
What that's sort of basically the turn off most of the time when people are approached with the idea of trolling for something. It's like, well, the boat gets to hold the rods and the fish bites, and so I miss like that kind of part of the equation. But a lot of times too, especially different species, that's literally the way that you have to fish for them.
Yeah.
Like kokanee salmon, for example. In our fishery, the only real effective way to catch them is to troll for them.
Yeah.
And so there's a short window at the end of the season sometimes when these fish get congregated to a point where you can jig for them. But that's a very short window and it's once a year. The whole rest of the season we are, except ice fishing, of course, we're trolling to catch salmon.
Yeah.
And so if you want to target kokanee salmon, you better learn how to troll.
Yeah.
Because that's how you're going to catch them.
Yeah.
And then on the other side of it is if you've got new anglers, very young anglers, kids that are just looking for a lot of action, you still get all the satisfaction of rod in your hand, battling the fish into the net. So you still get to feel the fight. You feel them fighting back. You feel them running around, pull and drag. All that stuff's the same as if it would be if you caught it casting or jigging. The only thing you kind of miss out on is physically holding the rod when the fish bites it.
Well, I think a couple of pros for it is like if you've ever stood and held a rod for hours and hours on end, if you're not like quote unquote in shape for that, your back starts to hurt. There's something to be said about trolling and like being able to sit down for a minute and you're still actively fishing even though you're taking a break for a minute and grabbing some to eat or reapplying sunscreen. There's something to be said for that as well, because man, I fished some tournaments with you and by like 3 hours in I'm like, can I just sit down?
Yeah, it's much less physically taxing on the body to troll as well.
Yeah.
So in some cases that can be what your body needs. Like you just need to be able to be in a little more relaxed state and let the boat do a lot of the work for you.
Well, and okay, I'm going to come at it from a parent perspective too. How long have our girls actually stood there and fished like with a specific technique when they have a rod in their hand? You know what I mean? Like trolling, you hand them the rod or they get the rod out of the downrigger when the fish hits it. But if we're like jigging for perch, I can name one of our daughters that will actively jig for perch and the other three are like, yeah, we're good. You know,
they get 10 or 15 minutes and then they're
and they're done.
One fish after another, it's like, oh, we figured that out, okay.
But if they're taking turns as we're trolling, reeling in the fish, then they're much more engaged. So I think there's a lot of pros to it when you sit down and like think about, okay, fishing with a group of people, fishing with family, fishing,
Yeah, you get to pick like a batting order sometimes, and so it actually kind of builds anticipation for whoever's turn it is to reel in the next fish. They're like in the batting box, like waiting for the next bite to happen, and so in some cases it actually becomes more exciting that way because it's like, oh, I'm up, I get to get the next one, and sometimes you don't know what it's going to be. It might be a brown or a laker or a salmon or. So a lot of excitement can actually get built up trolling too.
And the other thing our girls have done is like on our boat, we have different colored rods in each of the downriggers, and they'll pick a rod or a color and they'll place bets on who'll catch the most fish on their rod. So there's different fun things that you can do with it too.
So don't write off trolling as a aimless driving around with a lure. It is such a highly effective technique that, again, when it's done right for what you're trying to target, can In some cases, it's the only way to catch them, but in a lot of other cases, it can absolutely be the most effective way to catch them too.
Now, I won't make you go like super, super deep into it because we could be here again for hours and hours. But what do you think are the key components that make trolling effective?
Okay, when you start out trolling, and the system that we teach you is that there's sort of level of importance for what you need to really focus your effort on to make your fishing more efficient and better.
Yeah.
So the first thing that we really emphasize is fishing at the proper depth. So based on your target species, some research about where in the water column you're going to find your fish at that given time of year, and then utilizing your electronics and your map study and all those sorts of things, which we go into in depth in other seminars, you should have some sort of an idea how deep you need to be fishing for what you're out there to catch.
Okay.
So first thing that we really emphasize is you got to be fishing at the right place in the water column to start with. So having those efficient tools to get your lures as precisely as you can into the water depth where your target fish are living. That's number one priority, because you can have all the rest of this stuff right, but if it's not in the right water column, you're not catching anything, or in the right area of the lake or any of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So where and how deep you're fishing is highly important. The second part of it is speed control. It can make a stark difference in your catch rate adjusting your speed up or down as little as 0.1 miles per hour. You will see dramatic differences in the fish you hook and land by adjusting your speed by 0.1 miles an hour. It is incredible how much difference that little bit of speed in your travel makes. So that's something that we emphasize a lot. How fast were you going? And so, depending on your target species, again, there's different ways to research how fast you typically troll the gear that you fish for that species. What's kind of the optimal range? Like kokanee salmon, for example, we're typically somewhere between 1.2 up to 1.7 or 8 miles an hour, which sounds like a pretty relatively easy range. You're like, well, I'll just put my boat to troll at 1.5. I'll just go a mile and a half.
Yeah.
And that should be right in the middle of the range. Well, if you bump it up to 1.6, now all of a sudden you just caught 3 fish to the one you just caught at 1.5. And so that little speed adjustment can make all the difference in catching some fish and then catching a lot of fish.
Yeah.
And then the question we probably get asked the most across the board, like, what are you catching them on?
You see it posted on in every Facebook comment. Yeah. What did you catch that on?
What did you catch it on? And when we're out on a guide trip or during these seminars, in either case, the lure selection, as you get like real specific down into it, is the least important part of the whole system. Because you can be at the right depth, at the right speed with the wrong stuff and still catch fish. But if you have the best lure, like the highest catch rate, best system of dodger, spinner, or crankbait, or whatever it is that you're trolling with, if you have exactly the right stuff and your speed's off or your depth is off, then you won't catch very many fish either. So it's something that you have to put all of it together, but the lure selection part goes at the end because it's not as important as the other two things.
Which is interesting because the lure selection is what's marketed to you. It's what you see everywhere. Like, do you have the right color? Do you have the right this? But we've been talking about that. That's literally the least important part. Yes, it is still an important part.
Yep.
But the other factors are a lot more important.
So, like in depending on your species, again, there's a lot of scent that's employed with a lot of trolling systems, especially for salmon species, walleye, some other different warm water species. When you're trolling, there's a lot of scent factors that go into it too, that kind of add on to the lure selection part of it. And again, that would be like in fourth place past all the other stuff.
Yeah.
And so that's something we get asked all the time about kokanee fishing is, oh, what kind of scent we're using. We're using corn, which refers to white shoe peg corn. Did you have any scent in your corn? And our famous answer for years was, we've been corn free since 2003. Which is not true. We use corn a lot for salmon, but the idea is if you have your depth and your speed and your lure selection right, you don't need corn to catch most of those fish. The scent will buy you some more bites that you wouldn't get otherwise, so we definitely use it. But the rest of the system's in place, it's the least important thing.
Well, it's like if you were fishing for lake trout on the flats in 10 feet of water in July, they're not going to be there.
Right.
It's going to be too hot. So you're not going to catch one no matter what you do. So you have to do some research, study the species that you're targeting, and learn where they are to give you a better idea. And then, yeah, you rely on your electronics, your depth, all of those things to get your lures in front of the fish.
So hopefully there's a lot more people, and it seems like there is lately a lot more people that really want to get involved with trolling on a more, specialized level. And I think that's a really great way to level up your fishing.
Yeah.
Is to dive into where you are, budget wise, equipment wise, look into all these different tools that'll allow you to really control your depth at a more precision level. And then look at all the other tools available too to control your speed, whether it's an electric motor or an electric throttle control or a mechanical throttle control for your kicker motor or your outboard, trolling plates, drift socks. There's a lot of different tools to help you manage your speed, which we talk about a lot too in our seminar stuff. And then, when you ask around or when you ask us or you look at our fishing reports and we talk about lure selection, it's going to be very vague. Because in our mind, that's the least important thing. There's more to the trolling system that you've got to get dialed in first. And really the lure selection thing, as far as bait style, bait color, dodgers, squids, spinners for salmon, or flatfish or rapalas or any other tile lures we will use for lake trout or browns or any of the other species here. Of course, when you get into the fishing, when you start to really funnel down what's going to be the most precision thing for the day, that then the lure stuff comes into play, but it changes by the hour some days. And so it doesn't do us any good to say, well, yeah, today we caught most of our salmon with skateboard dodgers with purple spinners, because this afternoon that might not work, and tomorrow that might not work. But if we say, generally speaking, for kokanee, we utilize a dodger lure combo, and we like to really use a broad selection of colors, and you've got to have all of them on hand, because at some point that particular color or style is really going to be the answer for that day. But it's not always going to be the case. And so the lure selection stuff is always going to be a lot more vague versus the speed and depth stuff's going to be a little bit more precise.
Well, and I've seen where you and say Randy, you guys have two very different styles of boats as well. Randy has a deep V boat and you have a pontoon boat. And I've seen where you guys have been Randy, you'll say, he's I caught him trolling 1.3 on pink squid, and you're like, well, I was going 1.6 and used a purple squid, and I've seen you guys both have stellar days with two very different setups. So it's hard to just be like, yep, pink was the color today, when it was like, well, but it wasn't for everybody. So
yeah, and a lot of the system stuff it crosses over from boat to boat sometimes, but sometimes it does not, because everybody's specific system might be just enough different where it's not the same.
Yeah.
Like if somebody's using lead core and they said, oh, we caught them all at 2 colors today. Okay, well, how long of a leader are you using?
Yeah.
Or what pound test leader are you using? What type line are you using for a leader? Are you counting, is that 2 colors off the reel or 2 colors in the water?
Yeah.
And those are little enough, subtle enough differences in one guy's lead core setup versus another that it can cause one guy to catch a lot of fish at 2 colors and the other guy not to catch any.
Yep.
Because the leader type, length, the type of gear you're trolling, the speed you're going, where you're measuring, the colors that you're saying I caught them at 2 colors might be different. So it's coming up with that system for yourself that's repeatable, and that's the biggest part about the precision trolling thing is it's
a system.
It's a system that works for you, that's repeatable. And so that's kind of what we really dive into.
And the great thing about trolling is you don't have to spend a ton of money. You can start with lead cord lines on your kayak, your paddleboard. You can start very simply and then move up from there. You don't have to have a guide boat with 2 downriggers and lead core lines, and it doesn't have to start there. Just start with what works for you, your budget, and create a system.
So hopefully you guys picked up on a few little things that we mentioned in there. And we also hope that it sort of sparks that thought in your mind that maybe trolling isn't what people make it out to be. It's actually a very precision style of fishing that is highly effective.
And can be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And can be very family friendly.
All of the above.
So, thank you for listening to another episode of the Level Up Fishing Podcast.
And we will see you out on the water.